Hi, my name is Annette Bulovic and I'm the main historian behind the website Discover the Delights of Peeling Back History in Homebush, Canterbury. And we're fastly approaching Canterbury's 166th birthday, so I certainly didn't want that to pass us by without thinking back to some of the legacies that are actually still in the city that these settlers have left behind that you may not be aware about, and there are just some great stories. Now again, these are just a select few, this is not everybody, so this is just a few of my favourites that I like to share about. And just bear with me, this is off the top of my head, I am doing this all through AdLib, so just bear with me, but we can do it. Right, so the first person I'd like to talk about is Hamilton Ward. Now he was on the Charlotte Jane with his two older brothers, Edward and Henry, and they were a bit of a Hamilton was only in his mid-teens. He wasn't very old, and he was definitely in the care of his older brothers. And the brothers were a bit of a laughing stock because they chose Quail Island to do their farming. And but they went ahead and they set themselves up on there, and they were doing very, very well for themselves, and they were very, very well liked. Edward, in fact, was one of the first. He was on the magistrates' court, so he was very much involved in the early politics of Littleton and was well trusted amongst the settlers. One day they decided to throw a picnic, and amongst the guests were John Robert Godley and his wife Charlotte, and that's of course our founder. And they all actually got in a rowboat and rolled over to Quail Island, and they found Hamilton very distressed and very much on his own. And his brothers had gone out the previous day to collect firewood and had not returned to Quail Island. So you can imagine Hamilton had no way of getting off Quail Island. The boat was gone with his brothers, and so of course the men of the party immediately set out and sadly discovered Edward Ward in one of the bays on the beach, dead, drowned, surrounded by firewood. And it took quite a few months later to come across Henry's body, and they only knew him by his clothes. So a very, very sad story, and it really shook up Canterbury. It was one of the biggest blows. It was July 1851, so we weren't very old when we had our first real big tragedy. So you imagine Hamilton was very vulnerable, and luckily for him, the Godleys took him in. So he moved actually into the agent's house on the corner of Sumner Road and Oxford Terrace, is it? Yep, going up the hill there. So Hamilton Ward actually was boarding with the Godleys until his older brother Cosby Ward arrived. And Cosby Ward was a bit of a character too. He actually ended up purchasing the Littleton Times and was quite a scandalous writer and enjoyed writing wee ditties, but they weren't always the most flattering. His partner Charles Christopher Bowen, who was on the Charlotte Jane with his other brothers, he was known to actually burn the whole copy of the Littleton Times because Cosby had written it and it was going to set off a firestorm. So Bowen would just throw it straight into the fire and say, we can't print that. So a wonderful family. But the thing that's really been left behind by that family is this here, Canterbury draft. And that those who know the beer quite well, you may notice that just inside here is Ward's beer. So in 1862, Hamilton bought the brewery that sat on the corner of, well, it's now Fitzgerald Ave, but it would have been the West Belt back then, and Kilmore Street. He bought a brewery and named it Ward's Beer. And even though the company moved on and developed and stayed on, they still respected that it was Ward's Beer. Now what's special about this and why I actually kept it is this was the very, very last bottle of Canterbury draft at the Huranui. And of course the Huranui is the oldest pub in Canterbury due to its never lapsing liquor licence. So 1861, 1st of July, that liquor licence was issued, has not lapsed, and so the Huranui is regarded to be the oldest pub in that way. So I couldn't part with this bottle. I don't drink beer, but I couldn't part with the fact that this was Ward's Beer, the last of the bottle. As of 2012, this is now out of business. I think you only can buy it in kegs. You can't no longer buy it in bottles. So very special wee little artefact that I like to keep, and that of course is Hamilton's legacy to us. Next person I'd like to talk about is James Edward Fitzgerald. You might sort of know him from Fitzgerald Ave. He was our very, very first superintendent, and he's an absolute delight to read about and learn about. Just a colourful character. He again arrived on the Charlotte Jane with his wife Fanny, and when the ship came in, the whole trip to New Zealand, so 3 months at sea. Him and Dr. A.C. Barker were badgering each other who would be first off the ship. And apparently it was a bit of a friendly rival, and there was a bit of joking and stuff like that. And so they sail into Littleton on the 16th of December, around 10 in the morning. And both of those men get in the boat together, the rowboat, to go to the jetty. But before that, I should mention too that Fitzgerald emptied his pockets of all his coins. He wanted to tell his future children that he came into the new country with no money, so he made sure he emptied his pockets before he came on shore. But back to the boat, they're sitting together in the boat with a few others, and Fitzgerald's sitting very, very quietly, not saying a word. But the minute came up on the shore, he jump frogged over A.C. Barker, Dr. A.C. Barker, and was the first Canterbury Association settler to step ashore. And as he came up the road, the main road, along came John Robert Godley, and the two men actually wept when they saw each other. They were friends back in England, and of course seeing Fitzgerald, he actually didn't recognise him beforehand because he had a ferocious beard and a big hat, and he was limping. They'd had a snow fight on the deck of Charlotte Jane, and Fitzgerald had gone down and bunged his knee. He's actually bedridden for quite a few weeks, which drove him absolutely potty. Luckily he had a nice cabin, so of course when he came up the hill in Littleton, Godley didn't even recognise him at first. It took him quite a few seconds, and again put his arms around his old friend, and the two of them had a good old cry. And that was sort of the introduction of the Canterbury Association settlers to Littleton. So that's quite cool. So Fitzgerald basically, his legacy to us is Springs Road. It's one that you might not mention. If you think about Springs Road, it goes from Blenheim Road right out to the middle of Lincoln, because the Lincoln actually was the farm called the Springs. And if you go to the Liffey Reserve, in the playground there, you can actually see these natural water springs, which is how the place got its name. There's hundreds of them. It's absolutely stunning. And when Fitzgerald decided to sell the springs, he actually subdivided his own land into Lincoln. And Lincoln is to do with the Canterbury Association again, of a gentleman. He's the Earl of Lincoln, I think, off the top of my head. And he wanted to honour him. So he basically cut up his town between the east belt, west belt, as most towns did. But to make sure that he got himself remembered, if you look at the map of Lincoln, we've got James Street, Edward Street, Fitz Street, Gerald Street. So James Edward Fitzgerald. And then you've got Robert Street, Morris Street, Littleton Street. And they are, the names of four of his sons. So wonderful wee legacy there that many people may not actually... what was actually quite wonderful was when he went to Wellington in the early 1860s, and anyway, in the corner of James Street was this big lot of land, and it was sort of the wilderness of Lincoln. And over the years, everyone thought it was Crown land, and everyone kept looking at it. And finally, it got to the stage where Lincoln wanted to build a new firehouse. So they looked at this land that was been sitting there for years, absolutely wild as you can possibly imagine it. And they finally actually did some poking around, and that land actually belonged to Fitzgerald himself. So he'd obviously still kept a wee little bit of Lincoln for himself, but obviously something that passed away with him and no one else knew about it. So it was quite an interesting wee thing about that. Now the biggest legacy Fitzgerald's left with us, of course, is the press. The first issue, a copy of it here, issued on the 25th of May 1861. And the very first line is, "We shall make no apology for the publication of a new newspaper." And basically that was basically him slamming the Littleton Times. And Littleton Times at this point in our history was a very firm Morehouse supporter. And of course what was happening in politics around that time was the Morehouse Railway Tunnel, or you may know it more as the Littleton Railway Tunnel. So Fitzgerald had just finished his superintendency. He had gone back to England as the Canterbury Association's immigration agent, of course, because the association was gone by then. But basically he went back to help with immigration to Canterbury, and he soon returned when he learnt of the debt that Morehouse was, who was of course our second superintendent during the provincial government era, was racking up the bills, and he'd worked so hard to have debt-free Canterbury. So he was back pretty much very shortly. And because the Littleton Times wouldn't print his letters of complaint about Morehouse and the way he was spending, he started the press, and of course that's the press that we know today. So it's probably the biggest legacy that he had. He also brought the telegram to New Zealand too. The very first telegram in New Zealand was between Littleton and actually Sumner, and then the press offices in town. So before that, basically any news from England came off those ships, and the ships took 3 months to get here. So you can imagine how old the news was, but the reporters of the Littleton Times and the press would literally get into fistfights to get their hands on those letters and those newspapers to be able to get the news out first. So of course with the telegram arriving, it's boom 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 straight through to the press, and of course they were able to get news out a bit faster as well. And but I do like to imagine those reporters galloping over the bottle path with the news heading into Casual Street, which is where the press was. The press opened Durham Street. The press actually opened in the paddock opposite where the art centre is, the new glass art gallery. So right facing that, where those big old houses are, that was actually where the first press office was, just a little shack. But within a year and a bit, not very long, he had moved to Casual Street, and his dearest and nearest neighbour ended up being Whitcombs and Tombs, which of course is Whitcoulls. So Whitcoulls, of course, was lost to the earthquakes, but it gives you an idea of the location the press was during that time. And in the early 20th century, they moved to the square. That was history. Bit of an eerie thing, of course, is the earthquake that took down the press building. It was literally to the day that they had moved in. 102 years, I think, they had been at the square. That's the top of my head, so don't quote me on that. But I know that they had moved in on the 22nd of February, 1903, I believe. And to that day, that was the last issue from the square. So a bit of a bittersweet date to remember, to the day that last paper came out of the square as well. My next person is Sir Arthur Dudley Dobson. He was a 9-year-old on the Cressy, and of course his big legacy is Arthur's Pass. But before that, he sort of didn't. When he first arrived, he was with his dad and brother George. The rest of the family were waiting for them to establish a bit of a life here before they joined up with the family. But Dad actually couldn't find work. Edward Dobson, he was an engineer, a civil engineer. He actually couldn't find work, so he actually soon sent his boys off to his family in Australia. I think it was Tasmania, and so he was just looking after himself. But as a little 9-year-old, he sort of grew up, and when he came back, he grew up around Sumner, and he developed a love for engineering and building and surveying through his dad. George was exactly the same. He also got the love for that. And so one of the very first jobs that Arthur helped his dad on was the Littleton Tunnel, which I just spoke about with Morehouse. So as a young assistant surveyor and engineer, he actually helped Dad on the tunnel and sort of broke his teeth in that way. Another fella that was working on the tunnel was Julian van Hask. You may know that name from the Hask Eagle, Hask Pass, Hask River, a beautiful big Austrian fella who founded the Canterbury Museum. He was also doing his bit because he knew about minerals and rocks and things like that, and Arthur ended up marrying his sister. So a lovely wee connection between those two pioneering families as well. So basically Arthur was working for the Canterbury, working for the Canterbury Provincial Council, and even though of his age, he was sent out to find the quickest route to the west coast because of the gold. And so he went out with his dogs and actually with Maori trackers. So he actually was very, very fluent in Maori. He was very comfortable working with the Ngāi and it was actually a Maori track that he took. So it wasn't like he discovered it, but he knew the right people and he walked it, and basically it was the old greenstone. Greenstone's quite big, was a big currency for the Ngāi at that time, and that was the quickest way through greenstone country to the west coast, and that's how Arthur got his fame. Even when he got back though, they still didn't believe him. They actually sent George, his brother, in to have a look, and it was George that came out and said Arthur's Pass is the best way. And to Arthur's embarrassment, that term actually stuck. He was actually horrified most of his life about that, but that was how we came to have Arthur's Pass as well. He actually wrote his memoirs in 1934, which is actually the year he passed away. And if you read that and you see his sketches, it's an absolute delight to read. And one thing I've always remembered was that them lowering their dogs down cliff faces using Maori flax rope. I can just see that, and that's what I picture when I think about him going through that very first time in the early 1860s. Just a year after that, his dad, Edward, was the foreman of the construction of the road that we use today. So a huge family affair when it came to Arthur's Pass, which is just fabulous. A bit of a sad story about George, though, is he left his brother at that time to do his own engineering. He had gotten work actually over on the west coast, so he was off on his own adventure. And unfortunately, I think it was 1866, he was mistaken for a gold carrier and was murdered by the Grey River. And the little town of Dobson, which is near Greymouth, it's actually was built around his murder site, and the murder site is actually marked. So he was dragged away from the river and strangled by the Burgess and Kelly gang, and unfortunately, mistaken identity. They were expecting a gold carrier to come through, and unfortunately, George did that. So very, very sad for the family to lose George that way, but he is remembered very well in that part of the west coast. The last person I want to speak to you about, I've mentioned already, is the Honourable William Sefton Morehouse. He arrived on the Cornwall in 1851, so not exactly the first 4 ships, but still in those 3 years, 2.5 years of Canterbury Association ships coming in. Now, Morehouse is famously, I've always sort of remembered him as being a little bit fancy-free. He sort of was very, it would be right, mate, you know. And not only did he have personal bankruptcy, but which cost him his superintendency, because he was superintendent twice, but that sort of very easy spending and sort of very much inspired way of working almost cost him quite a bit over the time. So he arrived in 1851 on the Cornwall. The other big family on that ship that is connected, of course, is the Bailey. So Samuel Bailey was actually superintendent after Morehouse. They were quite good friends for a wee while, and they shared that voyage over as well. But Morehouse soon got tired. He was, again, very restless feet. And he actually took himself off he arrived with his brothers Benjamin and Thomas, went up to Wellington to try a bit of, because he was a lawyer by trade, did a bit of that, and funny enough, by chance, ran into his fiancée he had left behind in England. She'd obviously knew what he was like with his fancy-free living, decided to chase him over here and not wait, and by pure chance they actually ran into each other in Wellington after a very, very, very quickie wedding, off to the goldfields in Bendigo in Australia, and poor Emma, her first marital home was a tent out in the desert. But that was, and the brothers made no money whatsoever, so they were soon back in Christchurch making their way, and Morehouse, again, like I said, was superintendent twice. And when he took over from Fitzgerald in 1857, Canterbury was actually debt-free. We had even paid our debts to the Canterbury Association, which were the men back in London who had put money into founding our city. That was squared away. Most of the members there actually thought they'll never see their money again, but Fitzgerald made that his top priority. And within a short while, we were £20,000 in debt due to this foolhardy idea of a tunnel through volcanic rock, which had never been done in the world before. So most of our early politicians, they thought that was a second generation job. Christchurch was too young to have such a project, but Morehouse just wouldn't be put off, and he pursued that, but it took quite a few years to accomplish that. And at the time, it was New Zealand's longest railway tunnel, and the first in the world to go through volcanic rocks. So you can imagine it was quite a big feat to do, and that's probably is Morehouse's biggest legacy to us, is that tunnel. Through. Lord Lyttelton came and saw us in 1868. It was a couple of days after that huge big flood, and it took 8 minutes to get through the tunnel compared to going around Sumner Road, right round Evans Pass and through Sumner. So you can imagine very, very quickly. And Fitzgerald, who was actually living in Wellington at the time, came down to meet Lord Lyttelton because again they were all Canterbury Association members. And he refused to go to the breakfast because he knew Morehouse would be getting pats on the back and his tunnel would be being raved about. And of course he made a whole new newspaper about it. So he definitely wasn't going to join the pats on the back to Morehouse. The two were really not very good friends. But as old men, they were very, very close. And Fitzgerald, before he died in the 1890s, he has come around and said Morehouse was the best superintendent of his era. So the two of them did see eye to eye in their older years, and Morehouse actually was mayor of Wellington for some time, so the two men ended up in the same city. Anyway, so that's all I've got to say to share about our 166th birthday. It's just absolutely amazing that the city is going that long, and with the earthquakes too. People keep saying Christchurch is on its way out, but the Christchurch has been through harder times to get up on its feet, and I'm more than confident that our city is still going to remain a wonderful part of New Zealand, and what a wonderful, wonderful history that we have. So happy birthday, Christchurch and Canterbury. You're an absolute gift to live in, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. Just for those who don't know about my site or anything like that, that's the addresses there. I really would love for you to join in and read what I do. I write about the history date to date, and Homebush again is about the Dean's family, which we are a very first family on the Canterbury Plains. So please do join me, and have a wonderful day. Thanks for listening. It means the world.